Hi, welcome to the Pre-Snore History Hub. In this video we're going to be looking at Diem's government in the south. So who was Ngo Diem and what was his government like in South Vietnam? So Eisenhower was determined to maintain the government of South Vietnam. This meant propping up the president, Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem had served in the French administration of Vietnam in the 1930s, and he emerged as a leader of South Vietnam in 1954. In October 1955, Bao Dai spoke against Diem's policy. So he was the emperor, remember. If you're not sure about all of this, have a look at the Geneva Accords video. Diem's response was to hold a referendum, which is a countrywide vote on a single issue. He asked people to decide whether they wanted him or Bao Dai as their leader. US officials helped run the elections, which they were widely seen as fixed. In October 1955, Diem was officially elected president of South Vietnam. However, the elections were rigged, with 605,000 people in Saigon voting for Diem, despite Saigon only having a population of 450,000, so it doesn't really add up. The USA knew the elections were rigged, but they did nothing about it. They needed Diem as president. In addition, the USA had no intention of following the Geneva Agreement for a reunification election in 1956. So remember, at the Geneva Accords, they said that North and South had to be reunited with official elections, but the US didn't really have any intention of letting that happen because they thought that Ho Chi Minh would win and South Vietnam would therefore fall to the communists. The July date for this election came and went. He refused to acknowledge the Geneva Accords, although Vietnam remained divided at the 17th parallel. Diem, supported by the USA, refused to allow the election in South Vietnam. Diem knew that the USA would go on supporting him because he had prevented a communist victory in the South. He changed the government and in June 1956 stopped villages electing their own officials. He put hated officials in charge. As Diem grew more unpopular, so did the USA. So, keeping Diem in power. Diem said that Vietnam was now the Republic of Vietnam, and he was its president. Diem became less and less democratic. US advisors said that he needed to use force to stay in power. Eisenhower supported Diem by sending more advisors to train the South Vietnamese army, known as the ARVN or ARVN. He wanted the ARVN to win control of South Vietnam and for the US to fight a limited war. A limited war is where a country supports a side in a conflict by sending them supplies and training up their troops, but not actually sending their own troops to help fight. Eisenhower did not want to trigger a war with China and the USSR, so Soviet Russia, which might lead to the use of nuclear weapons. So what were some of the weaknesses then of the Diem government? So the first one was religion. So Diem was unpopular. He was a Catholic, while most Vietnamese were actually Buddhists. He packed his government with Catholic landowners, and Diem gave government jobs to his family members and Catholics, excluding any other group, especially Buddhists. He persecuted the Buddhists and banned the flying of the Buddhist flag on Buddha's birthday. In June 1963, a 73-year-old Buddhist monk, Quang Duc, set himself alight as a protest against Diem's religious policies. Madame Nu, who was Diem's sister-in-law, responded by saying she hoped for more barbecues. So this obviously did not go down very well with the Buddhists in South Vietnam. And that is a picture of Quang Duc setting himself alight. His harsh regime. So Diem's government was very harsh and he ruled like a dictator. He took US money but not their advice. He began a campaign against opponents. He was only interested in hunting down supporters of the Viet Minh and what he called re-educating them in prison camps. Those who would not change their views were executed. His Denounce a Communist campaign urged people to report communists to the government, and in 1957 he sent the ARVN into the countryside to find and arrest communists. This led to the arrest of 65,000 suspected communists and 2,000 deaths. And then land reform as well. So Eisenhower tried to encourage Diem to carry out land reform and give land to the peasants. However, Diem did the complete opposite. Land was taken away from the peasants who were farming it and given to Diem's supporters, often already wealthy, already Catholic landowners. The landowners forced their peasant tenants to pay high taxes and even made them work for nothing at certain times of the year. The few peasants who were given land had to pay for it in instalments. In total contrast to Diem, Ho Chi Minh carried out land reform in the north, and this was very popular because he was a popular leader in North Vietnam. He would almost certainly have won the reunification election of 1956. His major aim was to reunite North Vietnam and South Vietnam under one country as under communist rule. So the growth of opposition against Diem then. Diem's government was Saigon-based, which is the capital of the south. He had little respect for peasants in the villages and made no attempt at all to win their support. By the end of the 1950s, Diem's terror campaign had eliminated most of the Viet Minh supporters in South Vietnam. The remaining communists in the south began to fight back. In 1959, the communist government in the north issued orders to the Viet Minh to begin a terror campaign against South Vietnamese officials in the south. Over the next few years, an average of 4,000 officials a year were assassinated. In May 1959, the North Vietnamese, with China's support, decided to act. They sent North Vietnamese troops and weapons into South Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So you can see the Ho Chi Minh Trail on this picture here, the one in red. So the trail was infamous, really, and it was a series of dirt paths and trails that ran mainly through Laos and Cambodia, so neighbouring countries next to Vietnam, and it went from North Vietnam down into the south. So it took 1 month to get from one end to the other, and that's how they got supplies into the south. So that's the trail there in red. So in November 1960, some army leaders did try to kill Diem. Relations worsened between the US and Diem blamed the USA for the plot. The USA urged Diem to make reforms and gain popularity, but Diem ignored all of this, making their support of Diem unpopular both at home and abroad. In December 1960, former members of the Viet Minh in South Vietnam, supported by Ho Chi Minh, set up something called the National Liberation Front, the NLF, to oppose Diem's regime. Members went into villages at night and urged them to disobey Diem's government. They hoped to win over their support and turn them towards communism. The NLF consisted of 12 different nationalist groups ranging from Buddhists to communists. The front demanded the removal of Diem and land reform happening, and began a guerrilla campaign against the regime in the south. The group consisted almost completely of South Vietnamese. To Diem and the USA, all opposition was communist. The opposition was labelled the Vietcong, a term of abuse that categorised all opponents as Vietnamese communists. The North Vietnamese supported the Vietcong in the hope of starting a revolution in South Vietnam. However, this did not happen. North Vietnamese troops came down the trail and trained the VC and fought alongside them. Diem's actions had therefore led to, effectively, a civil war in Vietnam. So increased persecution of the Buddhists by Diem. At the start of 1963, advisors were telling President Kennedy, so by this point it's Kennedy that's taken over as president, not Eisenhower anymore, that the Viet Cong were being slowly defeated. However, on the 2nd of January 1963, the ARVN lost the Battle of Atbac, despite outnumbering the Viet Cong 5-1. Having better weapons and having US air support, they also lost 5 US helicopters, 3 US advisors and 60 troops. Only 3 VC dead were found. While the US military tried to make Atbac sound like a victory, some of the US media reported it as a defeat, and worse followed. On the 6th of May, government troops fired on a Buddhist procession, leaving 9 dead and 14 injured. In June, Buddhists were banned from flying flags for Buddha's birthday, and on the 11th of June, having alerted the press the day before, that's when Quang Duc set himself alight in Saigon. He burnt to death, and there was obviously worldwide publicity and shock at this. Kennedy expressed shock at the horrifying image, knowing that this had been caused by a government that he supported. So the overthrow of Diem. Kennedy pressed Diem to make peace with the Buddhists. He instead increased persecution. They raided temples and there were more killings. Kennedy realised that Diem was too unpopular to fight the Viet Cong. The US government didn't want to overthrow Diem publicly, but made it clear that he no longer had US support. The US government gave its support to a plot by leading generals to overthrow Diem. And on the 1st of November 1963, the troops supported the coup d'etat, so coup d'etat is kind of a military overthrowing of the government, surrounded Diem's palace in Saigon. Diem appealed to the US ambassador for help, but none was offered. The following day, Diem was arrested and shot. The governments that followed Diem were very short-lived. The general after Diem lasted only 3 months, and in January 1964 there was another coup d'etat, and the new leader, General Khan, lasted only a year. So there was a lot of political instability in South Vietnam. These US measures were too little and too late. Diem's corrupt government had greatly increased support for the Vietcong. By the beginning of 1963, support for the Vietcong had increased to 23,000. Within 18 months, there were 170,000 Vietcong fighters. This was partly due to Chinese support as well. The number of Vietcong guerrilla attacks on the south increased from 50 to 150 between September and October 1961. They won their first military victory against the South at Atbac in January 1963. Okay, don't forget to subscribe to the Pre-Snow History Hub.